Us in the studio, another man who knows a great deal about all of this, Robert Daly, former cultural exchange officer at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. He's now director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. You clearly know how these speeches come together, the points that the Chinese diplomats want to hit. What were some of the things that jumped out at you as you were listening to Wang Yi?
Well, very little jumped out because it was a fairly predictable, safe speech. All of Beijing's attention right now is on the success of the 19th Party Congress meetings in mid-October, and so he clearly came out with a first do no harm. He put out the usual Chinese talking points. He was very specific on the Palestinian question. That was the one place where he really came out with specific policy prescriptions about no more settlements and doing right by the Palestinian people. In most of the other areas that he covered, he identified a problem, but he ended up giving you sort of a vague, well, peace is better than war, sustainable development is better than poverty. Of course, not specific, very bromidic. But on that one, he was specific about what he wanted.
Let's talk about what John was talking about, the nuances, the ebb and flow of what happens here. Obviously, there's these meetings on the sidelines, bilateral meetings. Clearly, as he was saying, diplomacy is really the only answer. You know that there are a lot of players involved in what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. Talk to us about behind the scenes. What do you think? Give us an idea of the mechanism at work right now.
Well, diplomacy is, I think, the only answer, if there is an answer. And of course, we don't yet know whether there is and whether Kim Jong-un is willing to have discussions at all, let alone negotiations. But I think that Foreign Minister Wang Yi is correct in that it hasn't really been tried recently. Of course, dialogue has been tried and it's failed before. I think there is an opportunity at UNGA in New York because Rex Tillerson, the American Secretary of State, is there. And he's been very consistent over the past month in trying to find a road for dialogue. He had suggested that if North Korea would simply stop its nuclear testing and its testing of ICBMs, that could be taken as a sign that they were open to talks. Now, since then, since the first time he said that, Kim Jong-un has both exploded his largest nuclear weapon ever and launched more missiles. And yet Tillerson is still looking for dialogue. It was Tillerson who said what Wang Yi just referred to as the four no's. America doesn't call it the four no's. This is a Chinese formulation. But it was Rex Tillerson who said as an assurance, we do not seek the collapse of the regime. We do not seek the unification of the peninsula as a condition. We do not seek to have American troops going north of the 38th parallel, and we're not looking for regime change. That was Tillerson's articulation that Wang Yi reiterated, and I think that's a good message for Tillerson to continue to send. So I hope that he and Wang Yi can try to find some way to get dialogues launched, but it's not clear that Kim Jong-un is going to play. And let's remember, that's the source of the issue, is North Korea's development of nuclear weapons.
Is it helpful, though? You mentioned Secretary Tillerson. It seems as though there's two voices, though. There's the Tillerson voice, which seems more measured, and then there's the Donald Trump voice. How do you get caught up in all of that, or should you?
Well, if you were going to say that this was strategic coordination, you would say that it was good cop, bad cop. It's not clear that it's that carefully coordinated. And it is an important part of the American position right now that all options are on the table, which means that America reserves the right if, and remember, President Trump in his speech, bombastic as it was, did say if necessary for self-defense. And that's been reiterated by the National Security Advisor McMaster since then. If, meaning that if there's an attack from North Korea, we will fight back. And so sometimes the subtlety of President Trump's phrasing, that use of if, gets lost in the bombast and the threats, which are in some cases really sort of over the top and unprecedented. But this is actually an established American position that it reserves the right to use military means. And we do need to keep all options on the table now, even though most Americans think there isn't really a military option, to get Kim Jong-un's attention.
Robert, we'll keep you here. I want to draw in Nathan King, because you touched on the 19th Party Congress. Obviously, a lot of focus going into that, and Wang Yi kind of finished with that, talking about the advances of China and how far it's come in the last 5 years. Nathan, he was saying it's a safe speech because right now China really is focused on the Party Congress. It's a big one. It's coming up next month.
That's right, we'll all be there. October the 18th is the 19th Party Congress. And I think Robert's right. There's a lot of focus on that right now. And Wang Yi used this speech to kind of highlight some of the achievements over the last 5 years and going in to the next as well. Talking about the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda and tying it in to China's own development, the China Dream, the Belt and Road initiatives, the fact that so many people in China have been and continue to be lifted out of poverty as well. Let's have a listen to what Wang Yi said about the upcoming 19th Party Congress.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, the Communist Party of China will soon convene its 19th National Congress. It will be a very important meeting held at a time when China reaches a decisive stage of completing the building of a moderately prosperous society in all respects and a key phase in development of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It will open a new chapter in the pursuit of the Chinese dream. China will seek to realize its own dream in the context of the shared aspirations of all its people around the world, and continue to contribute to the development of all other countries through its own progress. Let's work together for a better future for mankind. Thank you.
And that's a key point there in the middle of what we just heard with Wang Yi saying, the moderately prosperous society. China, believe it or not, even though it's the second biggest economy in the world, is still, as we know, a developing country in many respects. And it's be a key aim to make China a moderately prosperous society in United Nations and statistical terms by the year 2020. And they are on target to do that. That's going to be one of the key drivers over the 19th Party Congress and beyond. I was recently in southwest China seeing a lot of poverty alleviation projects. There is no stone unturned when it comes to this effort. Quite incredible. And I think, you know, Wang Yi likes to, when we've heard him speak here before, show that the Chinese example can be one example, but also stressing that development cannot be dictated in one way or another. That countries should find their own model and have what he called harmonious coexistence. That's very much what was the heart of the One Belt, One Road initiative that we saw back in May and continues to be so, and stands perhaps in contrast to the Western neoliberalism model that we saw at the end of the Cold War.
And you brought up poverty alleviation. One of the things that we've noticed about that, it's not one size fits all. It's very targeted, very specific, exactly what you were touching on there. One of the things you talked about, the forum, and I was there for that in May, was the deliverables, and he described that as the project of the century. It's one of those feathers in the cap for China. It's also an extension moving outwards while the U.S. and Donald Trump moves inward.
Well, it's interesting you say that. You know, he mentioned the 270 deliverables, but the One Belt, One Road Forum is just up Donald Trump's street, isn't it? He likes building things. He's got a skyscraper right here, and one of his big things was infrastructure renewal in the United States. Beijing have made no secret that they would like the United States to get very much involved in the One Belt, One Road initiative. They think they could work together, bringing best practices of the US, China, and host countries into a, you know, as Chinese are fond of saying, a win-win situation. It's been quite tempting for the Trump administration. You know, the Obama administration kind of poo-pooed the idea, but actually, as you know, the Trump administration sent observers quite high up, people to the One Belt, One Road Forum. They also seem to be changing their tack on the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank as well. So there could be room for cooperation down the line. And the fact that Wang Yi highlights these things here at the United Nations shows that they are keen to share that with the world.
Good insights from Nathan King there. One of the things that was interesting about this speech is it sounded a lot more like Emmanuel Macron, who spoke after Donald Trump, because he hit on multilateralism, as did Wang Yi, and he also talked about the Paris climate deal. He also addressed climate in his speech. Let's have a listen.
Climate change bears on the sustainable development of mankind. It's crucial that UN continues to work on the follow-ups of the Paris Agreement and urges all parties to uphold the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities, equity, and respective capabilities, and reinforce international climate cooperation. The issue.
And we want to introduce Wang Guan into the conversation. He's joining us right now. Let's talk a little bit about climate change, about Paris Climate Accord. And Robert, I want to get your thoughts as well. Donald Trump very much against it. And then also one of the things, and I want to get your thoughts on this as well, one of the other things that Donald Trump seemed to be against, six-party talks. Not very crazy about the Iran deal. And Wang Yi talking about six-party talks in addressing North Korea. Obviously, you've got a lot of people invested in this, different countries. You're going to have to bring them all together to try and reach some sort of consensus. Give me your thoughts on that, and I want to get yours as well, but we'll start with you.
Well, in the case of climate change, of course, President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris agreements was seen by many Americans as a major mistake, and certainly cost the United States reputationally on the global stage and continues to do so. We'll see whether that is understood by this administration and whether they want to change. The six-party talks, and again, the idea that we need dialogue, that we need diplomacy to address the North Korea situation is correct. There's no question about that. But the six-party talks failed. And there were multiple reasons for the failures, primarily the behavior of North Korea. It's been tried and it didn't work. There's a contradiction in the Chinese view. On the one hand, they would like the six-party talks to be revived, although it's interesting if we compare the situation globally now to the time that they failed. Both the United States, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan are all more distrustful of China now than they were during that era. So it might not work quite as well. Also, China, on the one hand, would like six-party talks. On the other hand, wants to insist that this is really just between the DPRK and the United States, which are behaving like squabbling children, and that China is the blameless adult standing rational to the sidelines. So there's a bit of a contradiction between six-party talks and that posture. Still, bottom line, we haven't tried diplomacy under Kim Jong-un, and that has to be done.
Well, I think that China took a lot of blame, in fact, on so-called not doing much about North Korea, but the DPRK. But the thing is, I think it got more than its fair share of blame. Donald Trump's tweets about China doing nothing, threatening on trade wars with China. Think about it. China cannot do whatever the U.S. wants it to do with North Korea in terms of security. If the U.S. keeps its selling arms to Taiwan, keeps patrolling the South China Sea regularly, and keeps much of its Cold War era intelligence, military forward deployment intact. But in fact, China did do quite a lot. 9 rounds of sanctions on the UN against the DPRK. The recent one this month is one of the harshest yet. There are talks about the banks stopping doing business with the DPRK. So China has been doing quite a lot, and I would point out more than it has been given credit for.
And the other thing about China and the DPRK, you know, when we listen to that recording of President Trump talking to Peña Nieto, you can say to your neighbor, do what I want, but he doesn't necessarily have to agree. Each has their own domestic audience, and I think it doesn't matter how much pressure China puts on the DPRK. I think everyone would agree that Kim Jong-un's his own man and is going to do what he wants to do. So that's clearly one of the issues. And then I think the other issue, and maybe both of you can talk about this, somebody's got to keep the conversation going. And if everybody squeezes the DPRK and they have no one that they can communicate with, what happens then?
No, absolutely. We do need a diplomatic channel. It has not been tried. At the same time, I think that one of the conversations that the United States and China need to have, together with South Korea, Japan, and the world community, is what if he cannot be deterred or contained? Kim Jong-un may not be willing to give up his nukes. He may have already succeeded. In that case, the question becomes, how do we keep him from using, threatening to use, or selling his nukes? And then a big security question for China and the United States is, what does it mean to live in a more highly proliferated world? We could well see a situation under which South Korea, Japan, other nations for their own reasons wanted to go nuclear. North Korea has shown that if you have the will, regardless of how impoverished or reviled or how closely observed you are, you can do it. And so even as we try to get him to give up his nukes, we have to be realistic about this joint failure. It's not just China's failure, the United States' failure, it's a failure of global diplomacy. And what does a more proliferated world look like? This, I think, is the long-term pressing question.
I mean, I think in terms of proliferation, China and the U.S. are pretty much on the same page, or at least strategically so. Wang Yi today specifically pointed out the DPRK and saying that we urge the DPRK, instead of saying urges all sides, to abide by the rule of non-proliferation. This is one of the very, very few times, if ever, that the Chinese foreign minister or the Chinese president singled out the DPRK, North Korea, on this very specific issue. He said it is wrong, it's a dangerous path of continuing missile tests and nuclear tests. It was a dangerous path and the wrong path and a dead end. So basically, I think the two countries are pretty much on the same page.
Well, before we go to the break, one quick question. Will the sanctions work? Because in the past, we've seen sanction after sanction after sanction. It doesn't seem to have much of an impact on the leadership. Will these rounds of sanctions work?
No, they won't. That's an easy question to answer.
Well, I've been to North Korea. I mean, it impoverishes the people. I was 24 years old when I went there. It's mind-blowing. People could not even buy things from the market. It didn't work. It defeats the purpose. It punishes the people. It is against the wishes of the design of the sanctions. I mean, of course, it could just send pressure to the regime, but let's see.
And we have a lot to talk about from Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's address. We're going to bring in Robert Daly. He's a former cultural exchange officer at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. He's now director of the Kissinger Institute on China in the U.S. The guy sitting next to me needs no introduction, but I'll give one anyone. He's Wang Guan, one of our favorite reporters to have here on the set, talking about issues like this. I want to go back to something we talked about in the last hour, which I asked you the direct question, will the sanctions work? A very quick response, which was no, but we had a chance to kind of converse afterwards. And you said it's not good use of time debating the sanctions, that it's symbolism, really. What is a good use of time right now? I mean, because the clock's ticking, we keep seeing missiles, rockets fired off. What should be being done?
Well, we need to be looking for a path for dialogue, as we've said. Sanctions, you can do some sanctions. Any pressure you can bring on Kim Jong-un is helpful, but you shouldn't look to it to solve the problem. And you also have to bring, frankly, additional pressure. And this is something else the United States has not yet fully tried, which falls short of a military response, or what is sometimes called a kinetic response. And that is increasing the number of assets of the United States and its allies in Northeast Asia. We know, for example, that Xi Jinping and the Chinese government, while it wants a denuclear North Korea, objects to the installation of a THAAD anti-missile system in South Korea more than it objects to the North Korean missiles. If that's what he minds most, that's where American leverage lies. So let's look for more anti-ballistic missile systems, more defensive systems in Japan and South Korea. This is not a kinetic response. This is not starting war, but it's another form of pressure which I think it's interesting that the administration hasn't raised it yet, because they clearly know this. So this is something else they have in their pocket. It's carrot and stick, dialogue, but also reminding all parties concerned that more assets can be brought to bear within the region. Now, this is escalatory and in many ways dangerous. However, it does fall short of bombing.
And that was going to be my question to you. Does anybody really look forward to an arms race in the area, in the region?
Well, I think, for one thing, the North Korean regime, of course, you would argue that it's thinking about its survival, but it has legitimate reasons to do so. Look at what Saddam Hussein ended up doing, or Gaddafi in Libya ended up being killed by the NATO or the US-led troops. And also, just yesterday, President Donald Trump made it clear that he would consider scrapping the Iran deal. So that would be sounds like a threat to Kim Jong-un. And plus, there are thousands of military exercises in Northeast Asia by the tens of thousands of troops, forward deployment of the US military, intelligence agencies. So yes, the North Koreans felt threatened, and they're reacting to the threat by doing more provocative things. This is the way it is.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your insights and analysis, great perspectives, and it was a pleasure talking to both of you.